A millionaire found two abandoned children in the middle of a cold night and decided to take them home. The next day, the police knocked on his door and announced that, what will the police say to him? Continue listening to the thrilling and touching story below. If you find it interesting, don't hesitate to click the subscribe button and share this video with your relatives and friends. It was a cold night, the kind that chills you to the bone, even inside the comfort of the luxurious car Joshua Reynolds was driving. The city lights, usually bright and lively, seemed dimmed, almost mirroring Joshua's somber mood. At 50, he was a man who had reached what many would call the peak of success: wealth, power, and an impressive mansion on the outskirts of town. But despite it all, Joshua couldn't shake the emptiness that had shadowed him for years. His life, entirely focused on business, lacked something he couldn't quite define. That night, after an especially long day, he decided to take a different route home. This was unusual for him. Joshua was a man of strict routines, someone who valued control over surprises. Yet, for some inexplicable reason, he turned right instead of going straight. The path he chose led him to a part of the city he rarely visited, a dimly lit, quiet street where the luxury of his world felt out of place. The headlights of his car illuminated a sight that made him hit the brakes suddenly. There, by the sidewalk, under the weak glow of a street lamp, he saw a small figure huddled close. It was a child, barely visible in the soft light, with faint breaths visible in the chilly air. Next to him, wrapped in a worn-out blanket, was a baby. For a moment, Joshua froze, his gaze fixed on the children, unable to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a scene he expected on his way home, and for a moment, he didn't know how to react. The child, who couldn't have been more than 6, looked up as the car lights shone on him. There was something in his expression that pierced through Joshua's guarded heart, a mix of fear and hope that seemed to crack the emotional armor he'd built up over the years. The boy didn't say a word, but his eyes spoke volumes, revealing a vulnerability that Joshua hadn't seen in years. Joshua turned off the engine and hesitated for a moment. Getting involved in others' problems was out of character for him, especially when it was so far from his world of luxury and comfort. But tonight felt different. There was something about these children, a fragility and helplessness that struck a deep chord within him, touching a part of himself he thought long gone. In an uncharacteristic, impulsive decision, Joshua stepped out of the car and walked toward them. The cold was biting, and the stillness of the night felt almost overwhelming. He crouched down in front of the boy, doing his best not to appear threatening. "Hello," he said, his voice softer than he'd expected. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The boy looked at him, but didn't respond. The boy's eyes held a mix of understandable distrust and a weariness far beyond his years. Unsure what else to say, Joshua extended his hand. "You can come with me," he offered. "You don't have to stay out here in the cold." To his surprise, the boy accepted without hesitation. Slowly and carefully, he rose, holding the baby tightly as he reached for Joshua's hand. The boy's hand was ice cold, and his torn, dirty clothes barely offered any warmth against the chill. As Joshua led them to his car, he felt a lump in his throat. He knew this decision would alter his life in some way, though he couldn't yet see how. The drive back to the mansion was quiet. The children, clearly exhausted, asked no questions, and Joshua didn't know what to say to them. His thoughts drifted, trying to make sense of why he'd done what he did, but he found no clear answers. What was he doing? Why had he felt compelled to help these kids? The questions nagged at him, yet he felt a strange sense of calm, as if he'd done something he was always meant to do. When they arrived at the mansion, Mrs. Morgan, his long-time housekeeper, was there to greet them. An older woman who'd worked for him for years, she knew his private nature better than anyone. The surprise on her face when she saw the kids was clear, but her professionalism kept her from asking questions. She simply led them inside, ran a warm bath and prepared some food. Joshua observed in silence, still trying to grasp what he'd just done. There was something about these kids that unsettled him, something he couldn't quite place, but that kept him on edge. After they were settled in one of the guest rooms, Joshua found himself alone in the living room, lost in thought. The house, which had always been a sanctuary of quiet and solitude, felt different that night. He couldn't sleep, his mind replaying the scene on the street, the look in the boy's eyes, and the weight of the decision he'd made. He knew this wasn't something temporary. By bringing those children into his home, he'd taken on a responsibility he couldn't just ignore. For the first time in years, Joshua felt that his life was about to change in a way he couldn't reverse. The walls he'd built around his heart were beginning to crack, and though he didn't fully understand it yet, he sensed these kids had come into his life for a reason that time would reveal. While the mansion slept, Joshua remained in the darkness of his living room, contemplating the start of what would be the most important journey of his life. Dawn slowly broke over the Reynolds estate, casting soft golden light on the walls. Yet Joshua hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in the living room, restless, his thoughts tangled and unrelenting. His life, once so controlled and predictable, now felt like it was slipping into an emotional whirlwind he wasn't sure he could handle. There was something about these kids, something that stirred emotions he'd buried long ago. As he rose from the couch and headed upstairs, the silence of the house felt overwhelming. He'd brought these kids into his home, but he had no idea how to proceed from here. For a man used to solving complex business problems, he now found himself lost in the simple task of caring for two small children. Approaching the guest room door, he heard a soft murmur, almost a whisper. He carefully opened the door and saw Dennis, the 6-year-old boy, sitting on the bed beside the baby. Though dawn had barely broken, Dennis was already wide awake, gazing at the baby with a tenderness and concern that moved Joshua deeply. Despite his young age, Dennis seemed to have naturally taken on the role of protector, as if he instinctively understood that his little brother relied on him completely. Joshua stood quietly in the doorway, observing the scene in silence. There was something about the way Dennis cared for the baby that felt oddly familiar, as if Joshua were looking at a younger, innocent version of himself. It stirred memories of his own childhood, a time he'd long buried under layers of success and wealth, but which now resurfaced with an unexpected force through Dennis. The soft sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Mrs. Morgan, always prompt and efficient, came down the hallway, carrying a breakfast tray. Catching sight of Joshua in the doorway, her expression shifted to a mix of surprise and concern. She knew her boss well enough to realize that this was unplanned territory for him, and that he was more affected by the situation than he'd ever admit. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds," she said quietly, not wanting to disturb the baby, now fast asleep in Dennis's arms. "I've prepared some breakfast for the children. Would you like to bring them to the dining room?" Joshua nodded, still watching Dennis. "Thank you, Mrs. Morgan, though I'm not sure the children are ready to leave the room yet." Mrs. Morgan smiled kindly. "Don't worry, sir. Children are stronger than they look. They just need a little time to adjust. If you'd like, I can help Dennis bring the baby to the dining room." Joshua stepped aside, letting Mrs. Morgan enter the room. With her usual gentle patience, she assisted Dennis in standing up from the bed and led him to the dining room while carefully supporting the baby. Despite his usual emotional reserve, Joshua felt a wave of gratitude toward his housekeeper. He knew he'd be utterly lost without her in this situation. Breakfast proceeded in an unusual silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Dennis ate quietly, occasionally sneaking glances at Joshua as though trying to figure out what kind of person he was. Joshua, for his part, watched Dennis with a mix of curiosity and puzzlement. There was something about the boy that intrigued him, something that went beyond the obvious vulnerability. Dennis was a quiet kid, but there was a look in his eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond his years. After breakfast, Joshua felt compelled to do something, anything, to connect with the children who now shared his home. He figured the best way to start was by talking to Dennis, hoping to understand his situation a bit better. When he approached Dennis and asked about his family and what had brought him to the street the night before, Dennis shut down almost instantly. He looked away, avoiding eye contact, and merely shrugged his shoulders. Joshua didn't push him. He could see that Dennis was carrying something heavy, a burden he wasn't ready to share. The frustration Joshua felt from not being able to help gnawed at him, but he also realized he couldn't force things. He would have to earn Dennis's trust, and that would take time and patience, qualities Joshua rarely had to summon in his usual routine. Throughout the day, he kept an eye on Dennis, watching for signs and any clues that might hint at how he should respond. Dennis was astonishingly independent for his age, something that both troubled and impressed Joshua. Instead of playing or seeking attention, Dennis focused solely on caring for the baby. He changed diapers with a practiced hand, clearly not his first time doing so. He fed the baby with a bottle Mrs. Morgan had prepared, showing no sign of impatience or exhaustion. That night, after making sure the kids were comfortable and settled, Joshua retreated to his study. The house was quiet, but his mind was far from peaceful. Unanswered questions lingered, and he had a nagging feeling there was more going on than he could grasp. He sat down at his desk and poured himself a glass of whiskey, his usual way of unwinding after a hard day. But this time, the drink didn't bring the comfort he was used to. He stared at the glass, swirling it in his hand, when the thought of the kids sleeping under his roof hit him with unexpected force. What was he going to do with them? What place would they have in his life now? He knew he couldn't just turn his back on them, not after what he'd seen in their eyes. Finally, after a long night of contemplation, Joshua made up his mind. He wasn't entirely sure how or why, but he felt compelled to take care of those kids. There was something about them that stirred a deep sense of responsibility within him, awakening a protective instinct he hadn't realized he had. He knew it would be challenging, yet he also understood this was something he needed to do, not only for the children, but also for himself. With that resolve, Joshua finally went to bed, aware that the path ahead would be tough, but ready to face it. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something meaningful, something that truly mattered. As he drifted into sleep, the memory of Dennis carefully tending to the baby came to mind, and he knew this was just the beginning of a profound change in his life. The next morning started with an unusual stillness at the Reynolds mansion. Joshua, who'd barely slept, awoke with a vague sense of unease that he couldn't quite explain. The aroma of Mrs. Morgan's breakfast greeted him as he made his way downstairs, but there was a heaviness in the air, an unspoken tension that seemed to hang over the household. Dennis was seated at the table, skillfully feeding the baby, just as he had done the day before. Joshua paused at the doorway, watching them with a mixture of admiration and concern. He knew he needed to get to the bottom of the children's story, but he didn't want to pressure Dennis, not yet, at least, until he had earned more of his trust. However, there was a loud knock at the front door that abruptly broke the morning's silence. Mrs. Morgan, who was in the middle of serving breakfast, froze in place. Her eyes met Joshua's, reflecting the same surprise and apprehension. A chill ran down Joshua's spine as he moved to answer the door. Opening it, he found himself face to face with several police officers. At the front stood a middle-aged man with a stern expression and an air of authority. Beside him was a young woman with a keen gaze, observing him with curiosity. The man took a step forward and spoke in a firm tone. "Mr. Reynolds, I'm Detective Josh Campbell, and this is my partner, Detective Ashley Flores. We're here because of a report filed last night regarding the possible abduction of 2 children. Witnesses informed us that a man was seen taking a young boy and a baby from a street downtown. We need to ask you some questions." Joshua was momentarily speechless, trying to process the situation. The word kidnapping echoed in his mind like a hammer. He knew he'd acted on impulse when he brought those kids to his home, but he never imagined anyone would accuse him of something so serious. His first instinct was to get defensive, but he quickly realized that reacting angrily would only make things worse. "Detective Campbell," Joshua began, working to keep his voice steady. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I found those kids last night on the street, abandoned and in danger. I only wanted to help." Ashley Flores, who had stayed silent up until then, stepped forward. "We understand your concern, Mr. Reynolds, but we need to confirm the facts. Can we see the children?" Joshua nodded, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how best to handle the situation. He knew the police weren't here to hear his story. They were here to make sure the kids were safe. Mrs. Morgan, who had been watching from a distance, chimed in. "Sir, if you'll allow me, I'll take the detectives to the children. I assure you they're doing well. Mr. Reynolds only wanted to do the right thing." Campbell looked at her with an unreadable expression before nodding. "Please, lead the way." As Mrs. Morgan guided the detectives toward the dining room, Joshua followed close behind, feeling a mix of anxiety and helplessness. He knew things could quickly turn against him if he couldn't show that he had acted with good intentions. Entering the dining room, he saw Dennis and the baby just as he'd left them. The baby was in the high chair, happily playing with a spoon, while Dennis watched with a protective look. Dennis glanced up as the detectives entered, and Joshua noticed a flash of fear in his eyes. The boy didn't move, but his body visibly tensed, as though bracing for the worst. Joshua felt a pang of sadness, realizing that despite Dennis's calm demeanor, the boy was clearly terrified of what might happen next. "This is Dennis and the baby. I'm not sure of his name," Joshua explained, feeling Campbell's intense gaze on him. "I found them last night, huddled together on the street. I don't know anything else about them, just that they were in a dangerous situation." Ashley crouched down to Dennis's level, meeting his gaze with a soft expression. "Hi, Dennis," she said softly, trying her best not to startle him. "What's your name? And what's your little brother's name?" Dennis looked at Ashley warily, his lips pressing tightly together, refusing to answer as he glanced over at the baby. The look alone said enough, so Ashley exchanged a quick glance with Campbell, who gave a slight nod. "We understand that you're scared, Dennis," Ashley continued, with a gentle patience. "We just want to make sure you and your brother are safe. Can you tell us anything about what happened?" Dennis's silence spoke louder than any words. Joshua felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that the boy's silence could be a sign that something wasn't right. The detectives seemed to sense it too, and the tension in the room thickened. Finally, it was Mrs. Morgan who broke the silence. "Detective Campbell, Detective Flores, I was the one who helped Mr. Reynolds bring these kids inside. I can assure you, he was only trying to protect them. I saw with my own eyes how he found them. They were alone, frightened, with no one looking out for them." Campbell studied Mrs. Morgan carefully. "We don't doubt what you're saying, Mrs. Morgan," he finally replied, though his tone wasn't entirely convincing. "But we need to do our job. The children will have to remain under care while we look further into this." Joshua felt a brief wave of relief, but it was fleeting. He knew this wasn't close to being over, The detectives made it clear that their presence at the mansion wasn't just about the children's safety. They were also here to uncover if there was more to this story than Joshua had revealed. "Could the children stay here while you investigate?" Joshua asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't want them to go through any more trauma." Campbell thought it over before answering. "For now, yes. But you must understand, this is not a final decision. We will continue investigating." Ashley rose to her feet, looking at Joshua with a hard-to-read expression. "Mr. Reynolds, this is an unusual case. We appreciate your cooperation, but there are still a lot of unanswered questions. We'll be in touch." Joshua nodded, aware that his life, already turned upside down by the arrival of the children, was about to get even more complicated. The police weren't going to just let this go, and every step he took would be watched and judged. As the detectives left, he stood in the doorway, watching the patrol cars disappear down the long driveway. He felt a knot tightening in his stomach. He had done what he believed was right, but now he was stuck in a situation that could spiral out of control at any moment. Walking back inside, he found Dennis sitting in the same spot, staring at the baby. Joshua moved closer and sat beside him, feeling an urgent need to connect with the boy, to make him understand that he was there to help. "I won't let anything happen to you," he murmured, more to himself than to Dennis. "We'll find a way through this. I promise." Dennis didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. Joshua knew in that moment that the promise he'd just made wasn't only for Dennis, but for himself as well. Somehow, he would have to find a way to keep it, no matter how tough the path ahead. There was a gloomy and uncertain atmosphere at the Reynolds mansion over the following few days. Joshua tried to keep up a calm front, but inside his mind was in constant turmoil. The near-daily visits from detectives Harry and Ashley Flores only added to his anxiety. He knew his life was under a constant microscope, and with every question they asked and every detail they probed, he felt they were inching closer to a truth he'd rather keep hidden. Dennis, on his part, remained as reserved as ever. Though Joshua tried to reach out to him, his efforts seemed to hit an invisible wall. Dennis didn't say much, but he observed everything around him with sharp eyes, as if constantly assessing his surroundings and the people nearby. Joshua was beginning to realize that, despite his young age, Dennis had experienced things that had forced him to grow up quickly. One afternoon, while Joshua was working in his study, Ashley knocked on the door. He had seen her several times over the past few days, but this time he noticed something different in her expression. There was a mix of determination and compassion that put him on edge. "Mr. Reynolds, may we talk?" Ashley asked as she entered the study, a folder tucked under her arm. Joshua nodded and leaned forward, bracing himself for whatever she was about to reveal. Ashley sat across from him, and after a brief silence, she opened the folder and pulled out a few documents. "We've been looking into the children's past, but we've also reviewed your history, Mr. Reynolds," Ashley began, her voice steady, yet non-accusatory. "And we found something that I think you need to know." A knot tightened in Joshua's stomach. He knew this moment would come eventually, but he wasn't ready to face it. "What did you find?" he asked, trying to keep his voice level. "Years ago, you were locked in a fierce business rivalry with a man named Douglas Francis," Ashley continued without delay. "We know that rivalry ended disastrously for him. Francis lost everything, his company, his fortune, and his family. He vanished from sight after that, and we found that he spent some time overseas before secretly returning to the country." Joshua closed his eyes for a moment, letting the name echo in his mind. Francis. It was a name he hadn't spoken in years, yet one that had left an indelible mark on his life. The competition with Francis had been vicious. Joshua had used every trick in the book to bring down his rival and secure his own success. At the time, he hadn't stopped to think about the personal consequences for Francis. But now, it all came rushing back to him with unsettling clarity. "Are you suggesting these children are connected to Francis?" Joshua asked, opening his eyes and fixing them on Ashley. "We can't say for sure, but there are too many coincidences to ignore," Ashley replied. "Francis didn't disappear entirely, Mr. Reynolds. He reinvented himself under a false name, and according to our research, he's been watching your every move for years, waiting for the right moment to—" Ashley paused, choosing her words carefully. Joshua stared at her, understanding what she was implying. "To get revenge," he finished. Ashley nodded slowly. "It's a possibility we can't dismiss. The children could be part of that plan." The weight of her words hit Joshua like a heavy stone. He got up from his chair and began pacing back and forth in the study, trying to make sense of the gravity of what he'd uncovered. Francis, the man he had once ruthlessly destroyed, had returned, intent on making him pay. And now, those kids, whom Joshua had started to see as his own responsibility, were caught in the crossfire of a vendetta that should never have resurfaced. "What are you going to do about it?" he finally asked, stopping to look at Sarah. "We're digging into Francis's life, trying to trace every one of his steps since he came back to the country," she replied. "But the worrying thing is that he seems to have gone underground again, just as we were getting close to the truth. That makes us think he's on the move, and that his next target could be you." A wave of anger mixed with fear washed over Joshua. He couldn't let Francis harm those children or anyone else. For too long, he'd ignored the ripple effects of his actions, but now reality was hitting him with brutal force. "Dennis knows something," Joshua said, more to himself than to Sarah. "I see it in his eyes. He's holding on to a secret, and I think it's about Francis." Sarah nodded, her expression turning serious. "It's possible, but we can't push him too hard. The boy's been through enough. We need his trust if we're going to find out the truth, not his fear." Joshua knew she was right, but he also knew time was running out. If Francis was really behind all this, he could strike at any moment. He needed to protect those children, and to do that, he had to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it was. That night, as he walked through the mansion's hallways, Joshua felt as if a dark shadow followed him. Memories of his rivalry with Francis haunted him, mingling with images of Dennis and the baby. He had been ruthless and relentless in his quest for success. And now, those past actions had returned to haunt him. He stopped in front of the door to the room where the kids were sleeping. Carefully, he opened the door and saw Dennis awake, curled up next to the baby, who was sleeping peacefully. The dim glow of a bedside lamp lit the room, and Joshua felt a pang of sadness as he saw the look on Dennis's face, a blend of sorrow and determination that didn't belong on a child so young. "Dennis," he said quietly, stepping into the room, "I know you're scared. I am too. But I want you to understand that I won't let anyone harm you. Do you trust me?" Dennis looked up at Joshua, and for a second, it seemed like he was about to say something. But he stopped. Instead, he gave a slow nod without saying a word. Joshua stepped closer, sitting on the edge of the bed and placing a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "I know you're carrying a heavy load on your shoulders, and it's not fair," Joshua continued, his voice filled with emotion. "But you don't have to face it alone. I'm here to help, to protect you. Whatever you're keeping inside, you don't have to handle it by yourself." Dennis met his gaze, and for the first time, Joshua glimpsed something in his eyes beyond mistrust. Maybe it was hope, or maybe just a hint that he wasn't alone anymore. Either way, Joshua felt he'd taken a small step toward earning the trust he so deeply wanted. That night, he left the bedroom door slightly ajar as he walked out, a signal that he was there for the children, ready for whatever might come. He knew that the battle against the ghosts of his past had only just begun, and that he'd need every ounce of strength and resolve to protect the kids from the dark shadows looming over them. In the quiet hours of the night, as the mansion sank into silence, Joshua realized that for the first time in his life, he had something to protect beyond his wealth. He had these kids, and with them, a chance for redemption he couldn't afford to lose. The days at the Reynolds mansion were tense and filled with unease. Joshua tried to keep his composure as the detective's investigation intensified, but inside, the pressure was mounting. He knew time was running out, and Douglas Francis's threat hung over them like a menacing shadow. Yet, what Joshua didn't realize was that the danger was closer than he thought. One afternoon, while Joshua was working in his study, he got an unexpected call from Detective Ashley Flores. Her usually calm voice held a note of urgency that set Joshua on edge. "Mr. Reynolds, I need to speak with you. It's important," Ashley said, her tone serious. Joshua felt a dark unease churning in his stomach. "I'm in my study," he replied. "Come any time," he had said. It didn't take long before Ashley arrived at the mansion. Her expression was serious, and Joshua knew immediately that something had gone wrong. He invited her to sit, but she remained standing, as if the matter at hand was too urgent for comfort. "We've discovered something," Ashley began, meeting Joshua's gaze directly. "Something we didn't expect, but it makes a lot of things clearer." Joshua stayed silent, waiting for her to go on. "During our investigation, we've been keeping track of everyone in the mansion, not just you," she explained. "A couple of days ago, we noticed that Mrs. Morgan, your housekeeper, had been acting suspiciously. This morning, we found solid evidence that suggests she's been in contact with Douglas Francis for some time now." Ashley's words hit Joshua like a heavy blow. Mrs. Morgan, the woman he had trusted for years, was betraying him. He felt the ground shift beneath him. "What kind of evidence?" he managed to ask, his voice tight. Ashley pulled a small recording device from her bag and placed it on the desk. "We intercepted a phone call between Mrs. Morgan and someone we believe is Francis. The conversation shows she's been giving him information about you and the children. Francis pressured her by holding an old debt over her, threatening consequences if she didn't cooperate." Joshua felt a surge of anger and betrayal that left him breathless. He had trusted Mrs. Morgan, considered her almost part of the family, and now he was finding out that she'd been working against him all along. "I can't believe it," he murmured, his mind reeling with this new information. "She's betrayed me. All this time." Ashley nodded gravely. "We don't yet know how deep her involvement goes, but it's clear that Francis has bought her loyalty. We need to confront her, but I wanted you to know before we moved forward." Joshua stood, trying to control the anger boiling inside him. "Take me to her. I want to hear why she did this straight from her." Ashley led him to the service wing of the mansion, where Mrs. Morgan was in her room. When they arrived, they found her frantically stuffing clothes into a suitcase, like she was ready to make a run for it. Mrs. Morgan's face shifted from shock to fear as she saw Joshua and Ashley standing in the doorway. "Mr. Reynolds, she started, but the words caught in her throat. "Why?" Joshua asked, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "How could you betray me after all these years? How could you do this, especially to the kids?" Mrs. Morgan lowered her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I had no choice," she whispered, barely audible. "Francis, he knew things about me, things that could ruin me. He threatened me and forced my hand. I never meant to hurt you, sir. I never wanted it to go this far." Joshua's anger softened into a heavy sadness. He understood that Francis had pressured her, but the betrayal still stung. "Did you honestly believe betraying me, betraying those children, was your only option?" he asked, unable to grasp the full weight of her actions. "I was scared," she replied, looking up to meet Joshua's eyes. "But when I saw those kids, I knew what I was doing was wrong. I tried to warn you, tried to find a way to stop him, but it was too late. Last night, when I shut off the cameras and left the window unlocked, I knew I was making a terrible mistake. Please, forgive me," she pleaded. Joshua felt a painful tug at his heart. Mrs. Morgan, despite everything, seemed genuinely regretful. But the damage was done, and because of her, the children were in danger. "Forgiveness won't undo what you did," Joshua said coldly. "Francis is using those kids to get to me, and you handed him the tools to do it." Sarah, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Mr. Reynolds, we need to find out where the kids are now. Mrs. Morgan might know something that can help us get to them before it's too late." Mrs. Morgan nodded weakly, realizing that helping save the children was her only shot at redemption. "I know where he took them," she said, her voice shaking. "There's a property, an old house that belonged to the Francis family. That's where they are." Ashley turned to Joshua, who nodded with resolve. There wasn't a moment to lose. With knowledge of the location, they could now organize a mission to rescue the children before Francis had a chance to enact his final revenge. Just before leaving the room, Joshua glanced back at Mrs. Morgan one last time. "You're staying here until the police come to pick you up," he said firmly. "You'll regret what you did, but it doesn't change the fact that you've betrayed my trust in the worst way." Mrs. Morgan nodded, her tears falling silently as Joshua and Sarah left the room. With the new information in hand, Sarah quickly reached out to Detective Campbell and the local police units. Within minutes, a rescue operation was underway, and soon, Reynolds' mansion was a hive of activity. Despite Sarah's suggestion to stay back, Joshua was adamant about going with them. He couldn't just stand by while the children he'd come to see as his own were in danger. The drive to the old Francis estate was tense. Joshua could barely contain his anger and fear. He'd been deceived and betrayed by someone he trusted, but all that felt insignificant compared to the urgency of saving the children. An overwhelming sense of responsibility weighed on him, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to protect them. When they arrived at the property, the scene was eerie. Tall, dark trees surrounded the once grand house, which was now in ruins. It looked like the perfect setting for Francis's final act of vengeance. Joshua, Sarah, and Campbell, along with the other officers, approached cautiously, knowing that one wrong move could be deadly. The tension in the air was thick. Joshua felt his heart pound as they neared the entrance. He knew they were about to face a desperate and dangerous man, but there was no turning back. The children were inside, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to them. As the officers surrounded the house preparing to enter, Joshua looked at Sarah. There was an unspoken understanding between them. What was at stake went beyond personal vendettas, beyond any hope for redemption. It was a matter of life and death, and both of them knew what needed to be done. With one last glance at the front of the house, Joshua took a deep breath, bracing himself for what lay ahead. He knew this confrontation would be the toughest of his life, but he also knew he wasn't facing it alone. With Sarah, Harry, and the others by his side, he felt ready to confront the shadows of his past and save the children from the darkness threatening to overtake them. At that moment, Joshua realized this was his chance at redemption, a chance to set things right, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. The air around the old Francis estate was thick with tension, as if the atmosphere itself was bracing for the coming showdown. Once a symbol of power and wealth, the house now stood in decay, mirroring the state of its owner, Douglas Francis, a man eaten up by vengeance. Joshua Reynolds, joined by detectives Sarah Flores and Josh Campbell, moved forward with deliberate steps, aware that any misstep could cost them dearly. The police team had surrounded the property, preparing to move in from multiple angles. Despite Sarah and Campbell's warnings, Joshua insisted on leading the team heading for the main entrance. He couldn't stand back while the children, whom he now felt responsible for, were in danger. As they neared the house, he felt as if his entire life's fate rested on these moments. Silence grew around them, broken only by the crunch of branches underfoot and the faint whisper of the wind through the trees. Joshua could feel the adrenaline kicking in, sharpening his senses and preparing him for what lay ahead. "Remember, we have to proceed with caution," Campbell whispered, motioning for the officers to take their positions. "Francis is a dangerous man, and there's no telling how desperate he might be." Joshua nodded, his eyes fixed on the main door. Time was running out. Every passing second put the children at greater risk, and the thought of anything happening to them gnawed at him. Finally, Campbell gave the signal, and the team moved toward the entrance. Joshua, alongside Sarah, forced open the door, which creaked ominously. Inside, the house was dark and grim. Dust-covered furniture and sealed windows allowed only thin beams of light to penetrate the gloom. The entire place seemed to echo with abandonment and despair, mirroring the spirit of its owner. As they moved down the main hallway, Joshua heard a sound coming from one of the side rooms. He signaled to Sarah, and together they cautiously moved toward the source, staying alert for any movement. When they opened the door, they found an almost empty room, except for an old broken crib in the corner. Joshua's heart skipped a beat, fearing the worst, but the crib was empty. "The kids must be somewhere else in the house," Sarah murmured, her face tense with worry. They kept searching, going through each room with a growing sense of desperation. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the hallway with a faint glow coming from underneath it. Joshua felt a knot in his stomach, knowing that behind that door lay the confrontation he had dreaded yet expected. Without another moment's hesitation, Harry gave the signal, and the door was forced open. Inside, under the dim light of a single lamp, sat Douglas Francis in a chair beside a table. On the floor lay Dennis and the baby, bound and filled with terror in their eyes. Francis's face was lined with years of resentment and bitterness, but also with a sinister calm, like someone who no longer feared the consequences of his actions. "Francis," Joshua called, stepping forward, but stopped as Francis raised a hand, pointing a weapon toward the children. "Don't take another step, Reynolds," Francis said, his voice as cold as ice. "At last you've come to face the consequences of your actions." Joshua felt a mix of anger and fear surging through him, but knew he had to stay composed. Any wrong move could endanger the children. "You don't have to do this, Francis. Whatever happened in the past, I regret it. But these kids don't deserve this," Joshua said. Francis let out a bitter laugh, as though Joshua's words were nothing more than a cruel joke. "You regret what you did. You regret destroying my life, taking everything I loved. No, Reynolds, you have no idea of the pain you caused. And now, I'm going to make you feel every bit of it." Slowly, Sarah began moving along the side, inching closer, looking for a chance to disarm Francis without him noticing. However, Francis's sharp gaze landed on her. "Don't even think about it, Detective," Francis warned, pointing the gun at Sarah. "Everyone's going to pay for what they did to me, and I'll start with what you care about most." Just then, Dennis, who had been silent until that moment, made a courageous decision for a boy his age. He leaped toward Francis's arm, attempting to knock the gun away. The surprise on Francis's face gave Sarah and Harry the opportunity they needed. In a swift move, Sarah lunged at Francis, disarming him while Harry immobilized him. The gun clattered to the ground, and within seconds, Francis was cuffed and taken into custody. Joshua wasted no time. He rushed to Dennis and the baby, dropping to his knees beside them. His heart pounded as he loosened the ropes that bound them. "You're safe, Dennis," Joshua murmured, hugging the boy tightly. "You're safe. It's all over." Dennis, still shaking from the adrenaline, clung to Joshua, and for the first time since they'd met, he broke down and cried. Tears of relief, fear, and the weight he'd carried on his young shoulders all flowed. Joshua held him close, feeling the tension begin to melt away. The baby, though frightened, was also safe in his arms. Joshua felt a rush of relief and gratitude, knowing that despite everything that had happened, the children were unharmed. Meanwhile, Harry led Francis out of the room, his face marked with a bitter defeat, but also an odd sense of peace, as if capture had brought him some twisted form of closure. As the police secured the property and escorted Francis away, Joshua remained in the room with Dennis and the baby, unable to take his eyes off them. Sarah came over, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We did it," she said softly. "They're safe, thanks to you." Joshua nodded, unable to find the right words to respond. So many emotions had hit him in such a short time that he felt overwhelmed. But in that moment, as he held the children close, he knew it had all been worth it. He had confronted his past, saved the children, and discovered a purpose he never thought he'd find. As they walked out of the house, Joshua looked up to the sky, watching the first hints of dawn stretch across the horizon. The darkness was finally fading, not just from the night, but from his life too. With the children by his side, Joshua felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles he hadn't yet foreseen, but he was ready to face it, together with them, as a family. The first light of dawn crept over the Reynolds mansion, casting a soft golden glow across the grand halls and gardens, illuminating every room with a warmth that seemed to reflect the new beginning stirring within Joshua. The days of turmoil, fear, and uncertainty were finally behind him, and with Douglas Francis's capture, a heavy shadow had been lifted from his life. Yet, even though this threat was gone, Joshua knew his journey was far from over. A different kind of challenge awaited him now, the responsibility of building a new life and a meaningful future for Dennis, the baby, and himself. In the quiet hours after the rescue, he had spent long periods in solitude, grappling with the weight of everything that had transpired and pondering the unexpected path his life had taken. The mansion, once a silent testament to his success and solitude, now felt alive in a way it never had before. The laughter of children echoed down its long, elegant hallways, filling the once empty spaces with warmth and vitality. The jovial sounds of daily life had taken the place of the quiet. Dennis and the baby, whom he had named Roy, were gradually adjusting to this new chapter, and Joshua, to his own surprise, found himself profoundly attached to these children, feeling a connection that was as deep as it was unexpected. That morning, as they sat together for breakfast in the spacious sunlit kitchen, Joshua watched them with a growing sense of awe. Dennis, though still bearing the emotional marks of his young yet troubled life, and had begun to open up. His eyes, once filled with guarded fear and uncertainty, now held a glimmer of childlike curiosity, a fragile hope that was beginning to emerge bit by bit. Roy, seated in a high chair, babbled cheerfully, waving a small spoon and occasionally banging it against the table, his laughter filling the room. Watching him, Joshua felt a warmth well up in his chest, a feeling so rare and foreign to him that he almost didn't recognize it. Work and the relentless pursuit of wealth had driven his life, frequently at the expense of everything else. He had allowed himself to become isolated, disconnected from what truly mattered. But these children had shown him something priceless, something he could never have found in his business dealings or financial achievements. They had revealed the true value of human connection, of family, of love. "Today is a special day," Joshua said, his voice warm, as he looked over at Dennis, who paused, curiosity in his expression as he lifted his gaze from his plate. "I want to talk to you both about what's next, about the future." Dennis nodded, his young face attentive and serious. Despite his age, he had an unusual sensitivity, an ability to understand more than most children his age. Joshua's voice softened as he continued. "I've made a decision," he said, his tone steady, but filled with an emotion he hadn't often allowed himself to express before. "I want you two to stay with me, not just as guests, but as a part of my family. I want to adopt you, to become your father, if that's something you'd agree to." Dennis looked up at Joshua, his face shifting through emotions as he absorbed what Joshua had just said. His eyes began to fill with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief, of hope. Slowly, and without a word, Dennis stood up from his chair, walked over to Joshua, and wrapped his small arms tightly around him, burying his face in Joshua's shoulder. Joshua hugged him back, holding Dennis close, and feeling that this single, quiet gesture spoke more than any words ever could. "So, does this mean Roy and I get to stay here? Forever?" Dennis's voice trembled with emotion, his words almost caught in his throat. "Yes, Dennis," Joshua replied, his own voice catching as he swallowed back his emotions. "This is your home now, and it always will be. From now on, we're a family." Roy, though too young to fully understand the conversation, sensed the joy in the room. He started to giggle, his laughter bright and innocent, which quickly spread to Dennis and Joshua, both of whom joined in. In that moment, the kitchen filled with laughter, a warm, shared happiness that seemed to light up the entire room in a way none of them had ever experienced before. Later that afternoon, Joshua met with Sarah in his study. She had been by his side constantly over the past few days, offering steady and gentle support through everything that had happened. Joshua knew in his heart that without her guidance and kindness, he might not have come as far as he had. "Sarah," he began, his voice laced with gratitude and honesty, "I just want to thank you for everything. I can't imagine how I would have handled all this without you. You didn't just help me find a way to save these kids. You reminded me that there's so much more to life than just work and money." Sarah smiled, her eyes soft and understanding. "Joshua, this journey hasn't been easy, but I'm glad I was able to help. These boys have found someone they can trust, someone who truly cares for them. And that's the most important thing." Joshua nodded, recognizing that what they'd shared over these challenging days had been something special. He also understood that his next steps needed to focus on Dennis and Roy. "Sarah, I want you to know that you'll always be a close friend to us. You've been a light for us during a dark time, and we'll never forget that." Sarah, her smile full of warmth, nodded in understanding. "I know, Joshua. I have no doubt you'll be an incredible father to them. And though our paths may lead us in different directions, I'll always be here if you need me." With a long, heartfelt hug, they said their goodbyes. Sarah left, giving Joshua, Dennis, and Roy the space to begin their new life together. The days that followed brought about many changes, but this time they were changes that each of them welcomed, knowing that they were finally moving toward a brighter future together. Joshua embarked on the long, complicated process of legally adopting Dennis and Roy. Each step forward felt like one more piece falling into place, bringing him closer to creating the family he hadn't realized he was searching for. The Reynolds mansion, once a cold and grand space of solitude, was now being filled with the laughter and warmth of children's voices echoing through its halls. Previously, empty rooms were now transformed, filled with toys scattered across the floors, bursts of giggles, and moments captured in photos. The rigid opulence of the house softened under the gentle touch of family life that was slowly shaping it into a true home. Finally, the day arrived when the adoption was approved. Joshua took Dennis and Roy to the courthouse for the official ceremony, a simple but deeply meaningful event that marked both the closing of one chapter and the start of another. When the judge signed the adoption papers, Joshua felt a surge of emotion as he realized he wasn't just a wealthy man living in an empty mansion anymore. He was a father, a protector, someone with a purpose far deeper than he had ever known. That evening, the three of them returned to the mansion, celebrating with a modest but heartfelt dinner. As they sat around the dining table, Joshua watched his sons laughing together, savoring their meal in the moment. Dennis and Roy were now his family, bringing him a sense of peace and satisfaction that surpassed anything he had experienced before. Later that night, after tucking the boys into bed, Joshua sat alone in the living room, gazing out at the stars visible through the mansion's large windows. He thought back on the journey that had brought him here. From the cold evening he'd first found Dennis and Roy abandoned and vulnerable, to the decisions he'd made to embrace them as his own. There were bound to be trials ahead, struggles yet to face, but he felt ready, knowing they would face them together. The love and trust they'd already begun to build were the solid foundation on which they would create a new life. Before heading to bed, Joshua took a final look around the mansion. It no longer felt like a monument to his success, but rather a home filled with possibility and promise. He smiled, realizing he had found something far more valuable than anything wealth could provide. Together with Dennis and Roy, Joshua was stepping into a new chapter filled with love, hope, and a sense of belonging, knowing that, whatever came their way, they would face it as a family. Thank you for joining us on this moving journey. If you've enjoyed the story, remember to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell to follow more tales filled with drama and heart. We'll see you in the next chapter, where more lives, emotions, and the magic of stories await. Until next time.